Okay, so far so good. Now for today, how we behave. I'm very happy that Grant Watson accepted the invitation to tailor a program for this day around some of his very personal interests and a project that he has been working on for very long. He invited some of his friends, I would say, which is also great. I think that's the way to do it, more than anything else. Grant Watson is a senior curator at INIVA in London, and he has been employed at the MUCA in Antwerp, that some of you may know. I've seen a couple of his shows there, most notably a project called the Santal Family, about a sculptor in Santikinetan in India. And actually Grant has been here at the Rietveld before to lecture on that project. He also made a wonderful show on textile art and the social fabric, and actually this project is continuing in London, and he just had a conference there. I think for some of our students in the very great textile department we have here at the Rietveld would be very interested in connecting to that. So I'm really happy he's here. We will have an entirely different entry point compared to yesterday, but I'm sure there will be moments where we will see that there is some synergy in let's say, the communism of intelligences. That's a quote Franco Berardi didn't bring in yesterday, but at another moment. Okay, Grant, the floor is yours for the whole day.
Thank you very much, Gabriëlle, for inviting me to develop this day's program. Can you hear me sufficiently? It seems like a large, dark hall out there. As Gabriëlle said, today has a particular entry point, and that entry point is an interview that was made with Foucault in 1983 with Rabineau and Dreyfus for the magazine Vanity Fair. And I think it's quite an interesting way to sort of engage with Foucault. It was obviously written for a general audience. The strapline for the interview was about sex, food, and other ethical issues. So it was kind of aimed at a Vanity Fair audience, but it was also at the same time a quite structured and thoughtful interview. And in the interview, Foucault talks about some of his work on subjectivity, and in particular the way that he looked to classical antiquity to develop ideas around the notion life as a work of art. And so the question the notion life as a work of art is really the starting point for today's seminar. I think that I have to say I'm not a Foucault scholar, and the people in the program are also not Foucault scholars. So it comes out of a piece of work that I've been doing around subjectivity and Foucault, and I'm going to read a short paper just sort of setting out some of the basic concepts that I'm working with. But really for today I think it's very much about practice, and so it's aimed at the context of an art college, it's aimed at practitioners, and I hope it's something which people here can in some way, perhaps through the examples of the participants and the speakers, connect to things that they do. So in a sense, it's sort of looking at theory, but not somehow parceling theory off into a kind of separate space. It's kind of connecting it to artistic practice and life practice. So I'm going to start by reading the paper that I prepared, and I'm very much hoping that you can follow me. I'll read it slowly. I know that English isn't everybody's first language. If you really have problems, put your hands up and just sort of say slow down or speak louder or something like that. Okay. So Foucault placed the question of subjectivity at the heart of contemporary politics, and he proposed aesthetics as the possible key to thinking subjectivity differently. He invokes art several times as a category which could be applied to individual life, and in the interview in Vanity Fair, he says, "I find it surprising in our society that art has become something that only refers to objects, and not to individuals and their lives. He adds, the idea of the bios as a material for an aesthetic piece of art is something which fascinates me. The idea that ethics can be a strong structure of existence without any relation to the law, to an authoritarian system, or a disciplinary structure, all that is very interesting. So he's basically trying to say, how do we develop an ethic of the self that's not based on an existing system like the law? For Foucault, the promise of aesthetic creativity lies in its potential to provide coordinates for a relationship to the self, which can also be the ground for an ethical relation to others, but not a relation based on morality or the law. So how can we start to imagine a relationship to the self based on aesthetic creativity, rather than the idea of authenticity or subjection to a given order? Foucault begins this process by looking to classical antiquity, and the remarks which are dropped into the Vanity Fair interview are actually built on extensive analysis of classical texts. And the center of Foucault's work on subjectivity is a notion called care of the self, which is, as Gabriëlle said, somebody else is also developing this concept in the Rietveld. The care of the self, and in the interview he also talks about the notion of a beautiful life, or the art of living. And now the art of living has kind of other connotations through people like Deepak Chopra, but these are also things that Foucault was very careful to separate his work from, this idea of the kind of California lifestyle. He traces a sort of history of care of the self. So care of the self is a concept from classical antiquity, but it's not a singular concept. It's a whole shifting range of practices that he traces back to shamanism in Central Asia, through ancient Greece and Latin culture, and then through the Hellenistic and Roman period, and also feeding into Christian thought. But the historical period that he's interested in is the 1st and 2nd century AD, and in particular the work of the Cynics and the Stoics and the Epicureans. So he's sort of honing in on a rather particular body of knowledge around care of the self. But for Foucault, to look to classical antiquity, it wasn't about trying to find a role model in the past and sort of apply that to the present. It was much more to look at, in a sense, the problematic of subjectivity. How has that problematic been addressed in different cultures, in different historical periods? And he says what's particularly interesting about this period is that you have what he calls an autonomous self-fashioning practice with a plurality of forms, grounded within the immanence of the life world. But he also says elsewhere that he thinks that perhaps the whole of the thought from antiquity was in fact a profound error. So again, he sets up this kind of contradiction within his work, where he presents these ideas and these texts from antiquity, but he also refuses to allow them to become a template and a norm for contemporary life. Because, as he says, no model from another time can be a model for our time. So what you're left with, in a sense, is the problematic, the history of the problem, or the question of subjectivity that runs like a thread through these practices, and is recorded in the speeches, notebooks, private letters of antiquity. The question of how to live a better life, linked in turn to the question of who we are, and how can we understand ourselves better? Or as Foucault puts it, how can the subject be what he ought to be? How can he act as he ought? How can he practice the truth? So in Foucault's writing, it's always a he, but we can also say a she, of course. The ability to access the truth of ourselves is wrapped up in care of the self and is one of its key concerns. But in his work on subjectivity, Foucault demonstrates how the relationship of the self to truth takes on different forms according to varying historical circumstances. So, for example, his first example, in fact, in a series of lectures that he gave in 1982-83 at the school, École de France, on subjectivity, his first example is Plato's Alcibiades, which is a sort of interrogation between Socrates and Alcibiades, who's a young man. And in this text, the truth of the self is imagined as a sort of kernel that resides in the self and only has to be accessed by the subject. But he contrasts this to the Stoics, where the notion of truth is more like a medium that must be internalized, something that is assimilated into the subject through a series of practical and cognitive exercises, made manifest through action and speech. And this is what Foucault calls the subjectivation of truth. So in Christianity, on the other hand, the truth of the self is defined externally through scripture and has to be brought to the surface through the process of confession, for example. So for the Stoics, binding the self to truth becomes a personalized and structured practice that is incorporated into the art of living and which determines its course. Foucault uncovers in great detail from these classical texts a practice of the self which involved developing self-understanding, self-management, and self-orientation in a world of shifting sensations, the unfolding of events, and the presence of others. And in what was typically a practical system of thought, virtues were not seen as given, but like any other faculty, such as learning music or practicing medicine, had to be learned. And what Foucault does in actually a whole series of lectures that he gives, he sort of identifies some of the exercises which the sort of classical philosophers gave to their students to help them to gain mastery over themselves. Many of these include the acquisition of knowledge. And as Foucault sort of lays out these exercises, he identifies several important ones, which include listening, reading, making notes, and speaking the truth. So this is a kind of sequence where at the start you have listening, which is described, for example, by Seneca as a sort of rather problematic human capacity, because it's something where we have this sort of sound landscape around us, and the job of the student is to learn to identify out of all these sounds and impressions what are the things that we want to take in. What do we want to process, and how can we identify the truth and then kind of internalize it into ourselves as a practice. Seneca also advises in his letters to Lucilius, he advises him to read, but not to read a lot. And this is perhaps a kind of encouraging thing if you feel overwhelmed by the availability of texts that are out there. But Seneca's advice was not to read very much. In fact, to read only one or two books, read one or two authors, and from those authors only read one or two books. And in those books, only read fragments. So the important thing was to find the fragment that was useful to you, that you could use, and to imbibe the knowledge contained within that fragment, to memorize it, so it becomes part of yourself. And then interspersed with reading, so reading also is not a completely passive activity, he suggested that Lucilius take notes, and that he always had a notebook handy with him, so that he could sort of write down little things, little thoughts, truisms, things that he heard, and then even to recite from the notebook and to make that the beginning of the practice of speaking the truth. At the end of the lecture series, Foucault focuses on two particular exercises. One is the premeditation on misfortunes and evil, and the other was the meditation on death. And he explains that, in fact, because in sort of Greek thought, the idea that one would focus on the future was discouraged, because the idea was that the future was sort of nothing, and if you focused on nothing, then you, in a sense, become lost in the present. The past was something that you could recollect through memory and that you had control over, but focusing on the future was, in a sense, losing control. But then Foucault, he somehow squares this by saying, but actually when you meditate on misfortunes and evil and all the terrible things that can happen to you, what you're doing is you're sealing off the future. So you're saying that actually I'm prepared for any of these things. Whatever happens, however painful, however bad, I can cope with these things, and so I can protect myself in the present. I'm not lost. And when things happen to me, I already have the skills and the kind of armor in order to cope with this situation. And the meditation on death is also the same, has the same function, but then he also says that the meditation on death has another interesting function, which is to provide a kind of nodal point. It becomes a sort of point of meditation, whereby you can look at life from the perspective of death. So you might ask your question, if I died today, how would my life have been? And Foucault, he says that this is self-awareness or a certain form of gaze to focus on oneself from this point of view of death. And in fact, Seneca describes in his letters to Lucilius a sort of amusing anecdote, which was about a man who in the course of dinner was in the habit of conducting a memorial ceremony for himself, with wine and funeral feasting of the kind we are familiar with, and then being carried on a bier from his dinner table to the bed, while a chanting to music went on with the words, he has lived, in Greek, and the applause of the young libertines present celebrated this. So while Seneca chides the man for his debauchery, he observes that out of better motives, this is how we should all live our lives, as if every day was the last, and any further day was a windfall. And this provides what Foucault calls an instantaneous view of the present from above, that enables thought to make a cross-section of the duration of life, the flow of activities, and the stream of representations. This gaze from the point of view of death produces a tension in a life that is suddenly stripped of all casualness. It produces a situation where the question occurs, if I was to die tonight, what would my life have been? It totalizes a life and makes it available for evaluation. Drawing on the diverse meanings of the Greek word to save and salvation, Foucault unfolds the notion of these concepts to embrace a more extensive terrain than simply the transit from life to death and from death to the afterlife, so that salvation comes to refer to a continuous and ongoing process with life as its object. So, in a sense, salvation is not about, being good in this life and going to heaven. It's about saving yourself in this life, in the imminence of this life. Consequently, to say that a soul is saved, that someone is saved, is when he is suitably armed and equipped to be able to defend himself effectively if necessary. The person saved is the person in a state of alert, in a state of resistance and mastery and sovereignty over the self, enabling him to repel every attack and assault. Similarly, saving yourself means escaping domination or enslavement, escaping constraint that threatens you and being restored to your rights, finding your freedom and independence. Being saved means maintaining yourself in a continuous state that nothing can change. Whatever events occur around the self, like a wine is preserved, is kept. And finally, being saved means having access to goods which you did not possess at the outset, enjoying a sort of benefit which you give yourself, of which you are yourself the effective agent. So that's a very long quote from Foucault about his notion of salvation. So salvation in these terms is the self-mastery that allows the subject to face adversity, decipher the truthful and the useful in the constant flow of representations, achieve autonomy, and hone the skills which are needed in order to improve and cultivate the self, with the care of the self as the regime through which this salvation is achieved. It is both in the hands of the individual as something he or she bestows on him or herself, as well as something not limited to the single moment of an event, but a process that continues throughout life, extended across a lifetime, and one which would become organized in a systematic way as an autonomous, self-finalizing art, imparting value to the whole of life. It is not a finite process in which you gain understanding of yourself once and for all, but instead a lifelong practice that necessitates a slow, steady fashioning of the self that extends into old age. This is perhaps what Foucault means by the art of living, a life that is successively shaped by exercises, by experimentation, by creativity, so that it becomes a beautiful life. And in the book, which is called The Care of the Self, the second book in the history of sexuality, Foucault describes another quite amusing scene, which is the court of Cyrus, as seen by Xenophon, as a vision of beauty. So this is one notion of the beautiful life, where, due to the perfect dominion that each individual exercises over himself, the ruler publicly exhibited a mastery and a restraint that spread to everyone in the form of a moderate conduct, a respect for oneself and others, a careful supervision of the soul and the body, and a frugal economy of acts, so that no involuntary and violent movement disturbed the beautiful order. But Foucault says, actually, no, this is not really what the Stoics meant. The Stoics meant something which wasn't defined by this kind of social hierarchy, but was instead a sort of personalized practice that came out of individual choice and was tested out against experience. And he talks about the element of liberty in this. So in the court of Cyrus, it's a kind of order that's imposed by the king. But in the Stoic practice, he claims that the notion of a kind of beautiful life, or a life as a work of art, is something which comes out of a freedom of choice from the individual, whatever that means. But he does say that the idea of liberty comes about partly because the exercises which are given are so fragmented, so informal. So if you read the letters of Seneca, they just come in bits and pieces. It's like one friend talking to another, and you don't have this element of authority or kind of a template being given to the individual. And he goes on to say that this is in fact because we're talking about a form of life, not a format. Giorgio Agamben, in a lecture that he gave about Foucault's notion, life as a work of art, brings in the proviso that what's very important is not to think of the individual as kind of a priori to the work of art, or as somebody creating a work of art, but that the individual is in a relation with the world, so is creating and being created. I think the final point, because perhaps time is moving on, I'm overstepping slightly. The final point, I think, is to try and also position care of the self as something which isn't a purely individuated practice, but something which involves relationships with others. And Foucault, in his lectures, he talks about how care of the self is understood through a network of relationships, through friends, guides, pupils, family members, the people encountered in work and leisure. And he sees it as a real social practice, an intensifier of social relations rather than its opposite. And he says, if this formulation, the care of the self, is a system for developing and maintaining relationships to the self, is based on the assimilation of truth, which then guides and determines one relationship to others. And so I suppose that today, the questions for today, I mean, that I hope is a relatively cogent description of some of Foucault's ideas. And the question for today, I think, given that Foucault said that you couldn't just take this model from the classical world and apply it to contemporary life, is to perhaps think about how we would approach that notion today. And he says that, in fact, that in the contemporary situation, this concept is very weak, this notion of care of the self, despite the fact that you would think that we live in a very individuated, self-oriented culture, that this concept of caring for the self is very weak. And so he leaves this as a question. And so for me, in a way, I think that the sort of choice of speakers was really about sort of unfolding that question through practice. So it's, as I said at the beginning, it's kind of very much heavily based on practice, or based on a kind of discussion of practice. But I want to just very quickly run through the speakers, and when they speak, I will introduce them again. First of all, we have David Dibosa, who is going to situate care of the self and Foucault's work on subjectivity within a slightly broader framework of Foucault's thought. And then we have Adrian Rifkin, who's going to talk about the scratch orchestra, and what these things are will become apparent as the day goes on. And he will talk about this in relation to, I think, the questions of the seminar, but also a whole series of other cultural signifiers. A. Bronson is going to, who seems to me to be someone who has also been exploring these questions both in his life, in his work as part of the collective general idea, also in his subsequent practice as an artist and a healer, is going to talk through those experiences. And then we have a performance by If I Can't Dance, who I'm sure you all know, which is actually going to be the performance of the interview, by two performers who are going to make their own interjections into the performance and also reference past performances. And then Yael Davids will do a performance at the end of the day, and that has a slight kind of choreography that I'll explain before that happens. I think that's everybody. We have everybody there. Just to say that there will be a series of films which will be shown in between the speakers by Maya Deren. And there's mostly short films that she made with dancers. And I really wanted to avoid this kind of over-literal association between, for example, the body as sculpture and dance. But I couldn't resist showing them, and I hope that people can read them on various other levels than that. There's going to be a screening of a documentary on cardio in the scratch orchestra, which might have to be cut short. And also The Tales of Hoffmann by Powell and Pressburger, which Adrian recommended for the day, is being shown outside. We're hoping to put some of these films, if we can get permission, on the web. So if you don't see all of them, because you're walking in and out or they get cut short, then maybe we can access them online. Okay, so thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the speakers, and David, if you'd like to...